Mysteries, Mindfuck and Magic, welcome to the Otherworld, and welcome Julian Vayne, great friend and magician and author, and here for the first time at Reicher and Stark from Devon.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me onto the podcast, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So, Julian, you are on the forefront of the psychedelic renaissance, among with many other great people. What has been your way? What led you to this?
Okay, so I guess I feel that this is a question I get asked a lot within the context of like the psychedelic field, because as you say, I'm very fortunate to be involved with things like Breaking Convention, which is the big every 2 years big conference in the University of Greenwich, involved and friends with a lot of the people who are involved in the kind of license research into psychedelic therapy and the kind of scientific research, as well as the sort of medical stuff. So I'm kind of in that field. So very often people say, well, how come you're into this? You know, you haven't got a PhD in pharmacology or any of these sorts of things. And I say, well, I'm an occultist, I'm a magician, I'm somebody who has an interest in altered states of awareness, the way the human imagination is able to affect the universe and is radically uncertain about where the limits of that might be. And so I come to the field of psychedelics from the perspective of being somebody who's interested in occultism. Yeah, that's where I kind of come into this storyline. And, you know, people, myself included, who are thoughtful about this stuff are massively hesitant to use words like shaman because of issues of, you know, it's an ethnographic construct, cultural appropriation, all of that sort of stuff. But I don't have a word for what I do, you know, so sometimes that word kind of gets used because I come from a culture that doesn't have those roots and doesn't have that lineage. And so I often explain that my tradition is the magpie tradition. I have to just pick up things wherever they're shiny and beautiful and hopefully assemble something good with any luck with the instruction of good teachers. So I come to psychedelics very much from a magical occultist kind of perspective. And I bring into that, I guess, my interest in history. So I'm very interested in the way that if you look at the Western experience of psychedelics, there's a lot of occultism that frames that storyline, you know, and so I'm fascinated in the kind of the historical esoteric, but also the kind of very much as a practitioner of the esoteric, how we might use these substances in our work.
Mm-hmm. And we should include a disclaimer beforehand. This conversation is for informational purposes only, and we don't advocate taking drugs where it's not legal and so on. Yeah.
Of course, it's an important thing to point out. It's also, of course, interesting to recognize and remember that legality is a function of human action. So the substances themselves are not legal or illegal. LSD, for example, I have friends of mine who are research scientists who get to work with this substance. I have friends of mine who've been put into fMRI scanners, brain scanners, and legitimately in perfectly legal context injected with this stuff to see what happens to a human brain. I took part in a piece of research as a research subject in London in January of 2019, and I was given psilocybin, which under most circumstances in Britain is a Class A controlled substance in a perfectly licensed setting. So yeah, we should be thoughtful about this, and anyone who's interested or engaged in this area needs to be really kind of aware of the laws and the culture in their particular region. So it's a good point to articulate.
Yeah. Recently in our Facebook group, we had a discussion whether magic is possible without drugs. You know, and you could ask the question respectively: is the psychedelic experience possible without magic? So, how do these two fields intertwine in your opinion and your experience?
I guess for me, the question, what is magic, is something of a koan, because it is an unanswerable question with innumerable possible answers. But one way of thinking of it that I kind of like is that magic is the technology of the imagination. So magic is a way of using the ability that humans have, maybe other species too, but definitely humans, to imagine all kinds of stuff. And the ability for the imagination to affect things, notably our own psychology, but also our interpersonal relationships, and perhaps other things in the world as well. So if we think of magic as the technology of the imagination, then using those kinds of techniques that allow us to make radical changes to our imagination are nearly always techniques of the body, and they're techniques that have measurable chemical changes to the body. So long periods of darkness, fasting, dancing, you know, all of these kinds of techniques. Breath work is perhaps the most readily available and the best example of this. So breath work, connected breath work, the sort of holotropics, Groff style stuff, or something along those lines. You do an hour and a half of that, you will get visions. Yeah, if you know, it's just a given. So it's biologically wired into us, the psychedelic state. Whether we access that through something like breathing without faster and deeper than normal for a protracted period of time with no pause, or whether or not we access that by directly making a pharmacological intervention in our bodies by taking a substance of some description, you know, there are differences, but actually the phenomenology of what goes on, the neurology and the subjective experience, is incredibly similar. So I saw a paper that was published a couple of years ago now, which was looking at holotropic breathwork and comparing it with low doses of psilocybin. And the experience that people have when they do breath work and the experience of low dose psilocybin is phenomenologically, measurably, it's basically much the same. Yeah, so the state of awareness that we're kind of getting into, the state that we're accessing, is very, very similar. And what we know from the kind of, you know, this term psychedelic renaissance, which is I think a lovely term, respect to Ben Sessa for kind of putting that into the public domain in such a big way with his book. But that psychedelic renaissance is really showing us how the psychedelic state, so this state that's mediated by the 5-HT2A agonists in the serotonin system of the brain, these kind of processes, but that's embedded in human neurology. Yeah, so that's kind of a given. So whether or not you choose to access it by any number of different means, it's like it's a pregnant possibility inside the mind. And it may well be that this is this form of mind state is the kind of mind state that many, possibly all, magical techniques attempt to access. I guess the other thing for me, as somebody interested in the history of these things, is that when people talk about magic and psychedelics, they often sort of imagine that these are kind of two separate things. But even within the Western tradition, you know, the famous evocation of that Eliphas Levi does, you know, to visible appearance. There's a lovely essay that just came out recently in the Psychedelic Press Journal, which is a kind of a close analysis of a lot of that text and a lot of other things. And basically it turns out that magicians, right back in the kind of, certainly in the 19th century, were using psychedelic substances or mind-altering substances. You know, one of the things that Eliphas Levi doesn't talk about in any depth, which is unusual because he talks about everything else in incredible, arguably insanely boring detail, only beaten by maybe a couple of other writers are kind of worse or more elaborate, perhaps. So what he doesn't talk about is what's in the incense. Yeah. So what's in the incense when you do a goetic evocation are solanaceous plants, are mind-altering substances, often quite potentially quite dangerous ones. But there's plenty of evidence that within the Western occult tradition, along with, of course, those traditions that we know from South America and from India and so on, that there's a big thread of like mind-altering substances. You know, where would the alchemist be without strange material in their alembic flask? Where would the witch be without the stuff that she's stirring in the cauldron? You know, this is it is pretty much one and the same territory for me, anyway.
So, I mean, we come from a tradition, chaosmagic, where some people tend to say magic without drugs isn't magic. Sometimes I tend to agree in a way, depending on the definitions. But I think one of them, I had some long discussions with common friends about this topic a lot of the times, because in the beginning I was quite opposing that view. It sounded a bit dogmatic. It sounded a bit too, teenage, puberty, okay, this kind of chaos magic. But after years and years of discussion, I started to understand it a little bit more. It's not so much, it sounds a bit like, teenage puberty stuff. But when you look behind it, it's like, okay, there is understanding completely altered states of minds that you're usually not used to access, even if it's just holotropic breathwork and stuff. It's like surfing psychedelic states, surfing hyperspace, being able to understand the symbology of the things that are happening, and understanding the difference between metaphor and meaning or reality or literal stuff, how to communicate with spirits, having plant allies, all this stuff, it makes a quite provocative statement a little bit more down to earth, so to say. And so over the years, I started to shift the perspective now towards more or less supporting that point of view, which doesn't mean that you have to be stoned all the time just to do magic, but you should be aware maybe in a way of altered states of consciousness, which are really, really different in those kinds of, let's call it 5 grams of mushroom will take you to places where holotropic breathwork will most likely not take you. That's it's just a given, or iboga or ayahuasca or whatever, and adding the power of the plant spirit. So there's, I just wanted to throw that in and basically support a little bit what you just said.
I mean, I think that the idea about there's no magic without drugs is intentionally a kind of provocative statement, a hyperbolic kind of statement. I think that certainly, I mean, I was very fortunate in as much as I did quite a number of years of magic without any reference to any kind of psychedelics. And then I had a youthful misadventure with misunderstanding how big LSD is. That is to say, I took a number of things that I thought were just, I took basically what I thought were 2 trips, and it turned out that it was 4, because the little lines that mark the perforations, apparently that was important. Anyway, I had no idea, but I was very pleased to have had a grounding in like meditation, and actually in that particular context, Kabbalah, because I spent a lot of time in my imaginary world, moving through this kind of Kabbalistic universe. So I was very pleased to have had that kind of those magical skills in place before exploring psychedelics. And that's just my story. It doesn't mean it's a good way of doing it. It's just that's what happened to me. So I think, like any of these things, magic involves altering perception and altering consciousness. And the thing about psychedelic substances is that they do this in a way which only very extreme other physical activities will do. So, violent injury, long periods of ecstatic sex will do this. If you're laboring with your child, if you're a mother, that will give you those kind of states. Being born, dying, those kind of extreme things. But psychedelics allow you to access many of those states in a way that is actually remarkably safe, and has running through it there's lots of material in that, in various different traditions and various different styles, for like, well, how do we work with these states? What do we do with them? Yes, we can take mushrooms, and that's great, 5 grams, 10 grams, whatever. But also, what can we do within these environments, and how does that operate? And I think that what magic kind of brings to the party is this idea of the kind of curation of the space. So this idea of set and setting. So creating an altered state of awareness, but then framing it and kind of holding it in a way where there is perhaps specific intention, or where there's an awareness of the kind of way that we want the experience to unfold, or just kind of creating a sort of a crucible within which this altered state of awareness kind of happens. So I admire the youthful excitement of saying that there is no magic without drugs. I would certainly say that it's important to bring into the drug state, bring into the use of psychedelics. For me, it's important to bring in like a baseline practice. Yeah. So it's I find it important to have some kind of body work practice, you know, yoga, tai chi, whatever it happens to be, something about being present in the body, and something about being present in the sort of the unmediated now. So like silent meditation, you know, meditation on breath, that kind of stuff. So having those kind of baseline practices, I think they help create a good foundation for doing those other forays into altered states of awareness, including the use of psychedelics.
Hmm. You write about these techniques in two wonderful books. Your first one was the Pharmacon, and the second one, which is more practically orientated, my point of view, Getting Higher. And I love those two. And maybe we can take off from Getting Higher, where you write at the start the reasons for getting higher in a magical surrounding. So why should we, why could we use drugs? What are the purposes?
I'm glad you like the books. I'm glad you enjoyed them. I mean, Getting Higher in particular has been really well received, and I'm very, very pleased for that. Partly because it's an articulation. It's not just my stuff, you know. I've learned things from amazing people, and I hope I'm doing reasonably well in making that accessible to people, because there's a whole generation of folk out there buying all kinds of exciting material online, and there's a lot of online advice and information, but hopefully that kind of adds something useful to it. And one of the opening sections, like you say, is it says, well, why bother doing this? What's it all about, you know? And I think that basically that you know, there are many answers to that, just like there's many answers to the question, what is magic? So I think that one reason for taking psychedelics is that they allow us to enter this state of awareness, which is mediated by often, not exclusively, but often alterations in the serotonin system of the brain. And within that state of awareness, there are some remarkable possibilities and some remarkable abilities that are clearly located in that state. So, for example, problem solving is probably the most easy way of describing it in a nutshell, in a simple kind of envelope, which is just that if you have a problem, let's imagine your problem is something that we would medicalize and call post-traumatic stress disorder. So your problem is that you continuously ruminate, you continuously go back over the horrible things that have happened to you in your past. What the psychedelic state allows people to do is to problem solve the difficulty that state of awareness creates for them. So they're able to, in the psychedelic state, and this is allowing for the fact that it has to be curated in a certain way, it has to be led in a certain way, and so on. But the opportunity the psychedelic state provides is for people to see their problem, their post-traumatic stress disorder, their anxiety, their depression, from a radically new perspective. And from that radically new perspective, people are often able to kind of have sometimes in the session, sometimes afterwards, they have an aha, a discovery, a eureka moment. And they go, oh, I see, I understand, I can see this in a different way. And what happens with a human, what happens with all of us, what certainly happens with me, is that when we kind of go round and round the same loop, you know, and we get kind of stuck in a rut, we get stuck in this kind of process, that psychedelics can allow us to kind of radically change our perspective on those things and have new insights. So there was another piece of experimentation that was done in Britain in, I think it was about 2015, 2016, something like this, looking at, can you use LSD to help people problem solve? So this was working with scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and so on. And although we're most familiar with the idea that psychedelics can help problem solve in the sense of psychological difficulties, they can also help us problem solve in the form of like real world mathematical engineering kind of problems, you know. And the research that was done was tentative, and it's early days, but it seemed to come back and say, actually, yes, unsurprisingly, you need enough psychedelics that it works, but you don't need so much that you completely forget about what it was you were supposed to be thinking about. So 75 mics of LSD seems to be the sweet spot for most people. And we also know that there are anecdotal accounts of people discovering things. I think the RNA polymerase reaction used as part of DNA testing and profiling was discovered by somebody who claims that they saw the answer to their problem, this chemical engineering problem, in an LSD experience. So problem solving is one of the things that they allow us to do. Maybe they allow us to experience what it may be like to be born, maybe what it perhaps it feels like to die. Certainly one of the things that psychedelic experiences teach us is the value of learning to let go, of learning to let experiences happen through us. They allow us opportunities to be very present in the moment. They allow us opportunities to see the world in a new way, which a friend of mine once described as, you know, that moment when you pull back the curtain and you suddenly see it snowed the day before. And before you start worrying about how you're going to get to work and stuff, there's a moment of like, I see the world in a new way. That's what they do. That's what they can do. And that can allow us to remember and remind ourselves of the beauty of the way our own hands work, or the way the sky is, you know, this phenomenal artwork that we live underneath all the time and we mostly ignore. So they have this ability to sort of allow us to problem solve, allow us to see things from new perspectives, allow us to activate this healing opportunity, which comes from the problem solving, the seeing some things from a new perspective. It allows us to reminds ourselves of the magic of the world. And also, I guess, it places us in a situation where we often feel reconnected with the world, which is kind of curious, that we take a thing inside ourselves, which is, you know, it's a personal experience, and yet we know from, again, recent research, and also plenty of anecdotal evidence, that the ability for psychedelics to help people connect with nature, with each other, with aspects of themselves, and so on. There are many reasons why these are valuable medicines.
Mm-hmm. It just came to mind, like maybe you could bracket all these reasons and call it instills a new sense of wonder.
I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, as an occultist, I guess one way I would describe it is it's like a way of touching the mystery. So that the mystery, in a sense, is, you know, it's the possibility that's always there. It's the kind of the end of the rainbow. It's an unreachable thing, but it allows us to kind of open up and wonder. Like you said, it's that amazement, and very often it's that sense of like opening up. Like people who have post-traumatic stress disorder and they're treated with MDMA psychotherapy, you know, what they're fundamentally doing is they're remembering like the wonder of being alive, and then they're taking themselves away from being purely identified as a person with this problem, and they are able to see things in this new, broader perspective. And often there is a wonder in that. It's often an important part of the experience. We know from recent research that mystical experience is correlated strongly with a positive therapeutic outcome. So the more people are amazed and wonder, often, not always, but often, that's actually an important part of that kind of healing, of that reminding ourselves of the mystery of the world. You know, we get so embedded in, I don't know, just going to work, dealing with our families, you know, all the stuff that we have to do, that looking up again at the sky and being reminded of the wonder of that, and the mystery of the fact that we can look up at the sky. Like we, collections of atoms from long dead stars, can look up at a sky on a planet and cognize it. and be aware of that. And psychedelics, I think, definitely help us remember that that wonder. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and they also help, well, let's call it, have a look at the interiority of the world, maybe. Remembering that it's not that stars in the skies. It's like, let's call them spirits, let's call them ancestors, let's call them, there's another side to reality that you can access. So that's more the magical side. What you talked about, the therapeutical aspects, a lot of, not every substance, but a lot of still substances help with neuroplasticity. So it helps to form new pathways in the brain. It helps to resolve old connections in the brain, like, as you said, post-traumatic stress syndrome, where memories and certain memories and emotions are interlinked. And MDMA, LSD and stuff like that helps to, like, within a therapeutical setting and setting and intention stuff, all the basic rules of safe use, so to say, they help to open those connections and help to, when you are in a post-traumatic stress syndrome, you're often trapped within those loops, and you cannot, you're always basically reliving that traumatic experiences and hardening it. And through the help of the substances, you're able to resolve that and make new connections and put the things that happened to you that you were always keeping alive in your mind and in your body, so to say, to put them in the past and process them and make new connections and see the world with from a new, with new eyes, so to say. So that's the psychological, biological aspect of substances.
It is, but for me, like, as an occultist, as a magician, and somebody who is also, like you, comfortable with the language of talking about spirits or entities or beings or whatever, and again, you know, I guess like many occultists these days, you know, we're all wise to the fact that, like, phenomenologically, you know, in terms of some kind of notion of objective universe, you know, are these things real? Well, who cares? Who knows? I've no idea. I don't know if my hand's real. I've got no idea, you know, whatever. It's just nonsense. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that I had a chat with a friend of mine who's doing, I think I've written about this somewhere down the line, doing MDMA psychotherapy, and his clinician working in that kind of field. And we were talking because what he was encountering was the fact that people were meeting spirits on MDMA in sessions and having these healing events. And he was chatting to me because he knows I'm into this kind of weird stuff. And we were just discussing, like, the phenomenology, the kind of, you know, does it matter if it's objective? He's a clinician, he's a doctor, so he ultimately doesn't care if the person gets over what their problem is, their difficulty that they're struggling with. If it's something that they consider to have been a real interaction, whatever that means, with a real spirit, whatever that means, then he's fine with it. And for me, it's a question of saying, well, you know, spirits, at least in one sense, for me, are about how we learn to understand about new things in the universe. Yeah, so like, the experience that people were getting in with MDMA, what was happening to them is that the neuroplasticity, which you can, which is kind of, you know, playing out down at the kind of the firmware level of the thing, if you want to call it that, you know, that's kind of working at that level of architecture. The psychological experience, the lived experience, what you and I might call the spirit vision that arises from that, is a spirit turning up who's a novel entity, or perhaps an ancestral entity, and saying, hey, going to tell you some stuff now. So for me, it's like with, I think, most, you know, chaos magicians, the psychological model gives us some information and some way of describing it, and that's cool. And then we can have like a kind of very materialist kind of model when we look at something like psychedelics, and we can say, well, actually what's happening is it's just neurons joining up, and the epiphenomena is the psychological thing. Or I can say, well, no, these are spirits, because what spirits are complex interactions of systems which arise in our awareness as apparent, separate and objectively real others, just like you do for me at the moment, you know. And we know that if we were to kind of pan back millions of years and look at us, you know, we're just flows of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms doing this stuff. And even in this moment, you're just like a little screen in the room of my house, you know. But I also, for that interaction to have meaning, you arise as this radically separate other. Yeah. So I can dialogue with you. The ayahuasca spirit, the iboga spirit, whatever, builds its body out of whatever it can find. Often things in our psyche that are that we will notice: eyes, non-mammalian movement, snakes are a favorite. You know, anything that the spirit, in an animist sense, I think kind of builds its body out of that stuff in order to arise and say, hey, Julian, this is a thing I've got to tell you, yeah? If we look at it at a molecular level, we could say that's the psychological expression of this knitting together of neurons. But we can also take that further and say, well, actually, this is the psychological expression of this magical moment, which includes these neurons and includes everything that leads up to that moment. So for me, just like the clinician that I was chatting with, we don't care. We don't really care the ontological status of the spirit, except to say that that my view is that it's important in many situations to be able to countenance the subjective reality of what goes on, to be able to really kind of say to the person, oh, so you met a spirit, right? Okay. I don't need to bracket this by saying, oh, but it's not real. Who cares? It's just, you know, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, there's like that Jungian thing about, like, you enter into this dialogue. Sure, as a magician and maybe as a clinician, there are points at which you kind of go, oh, I'm going to step back from it and I want to describe it now purely in mechanical kind of terms, because I think I've gone a bit, you know, too much in one direction, and I'm losing information, actually. I'm not seeing other kind of insights. Okay? But it's also important, particularly in our culture, to say, yeah, I met a spirit and the spirit told me something, and that led to me having this powerful experience with MDMA, which is not known for its spirit interactions, and for most people, and that's fine. You know, it's those people encountered spirits while taking MDMA to address their chronic alcoholism, which is actually what that research was about.
Yeah, I like that these models are not mutually exclusive. But for me, I encounter these substances, or for me, they are spirits. They're separate entities with their own agenda, and they want to experience the world. They want to interact with us, and yeah, it's a sort of a meeting place. These states where we can actually do magic on a very different level. And you described some possibilities, what you can do in a psychedelic state magically. So what has been your experiences with that?
I think it can be so variable, can't it? Because you can, I mean, at the simplest level, you can have something like, the example I often give is that you can have a particular intention. Let's imagine a sigil, you know, piece of, quote, results magic sigil stuff. The kind of the most well-known and in looked at in some respects, from some perspectives, quite kind of one-dimensional styles of sorcery. You know, I want to do this thing. Maybe it's an enchantment on myself if I'm being thoughtful about it. Maybe it's something in the world. Who knows? But I want to do a spell. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my altered state of awareness on the dance floor, having taken MDMA, and I'm going to, I don't know, the example I think I give in Getting Higher is, you know, you can draw this on your body and you can dance to sweat that out. And in the sigil being liberated into the dance floor, you can imagine, you can create this kind of sympathetic magical link, or this mimetic magical link between, you know, as this thing happens, so this other thing takes place. Yeah, it's going to be something as simple as that. You can have, obviously, rituals which are particularly, say, like a group ceremonies with psychedelics that can have all kinds of particular focuses. They may have like specific results magic orientated stuff, or very often they may be about like creating a space in which all kinds of very important processing can take place for the individual and for the community, and that can affect the wider culture. So a good example of that would be the Native American church with their use of peyote. So the Native American church developed the peyote ceremony towards the end of the 19th century, and it was in response to the genocide, essentially, of the Plains Indian people in North America. So the peyote came to them, came as part of that kind of tradition. People like Quanah Parker and James Moody, these kind of people sort of being involved in that story, and they developed this beautiful, beautiful ritual, which they call the design. You know, it's often referred to as a design. You know, the design of the ceremony comes to us, blah, blah, blah. And the purpose of that was to give those people the resilience to deal with alcoholism, which was destroying huge numbers of Native American people because they were suffering and they were taking refuge in what was available, and it tended to be whiskey, and also helping those people to develop a kind of a self-esteem and a power that could help them because they were in very, very difficult circumstances. And not that that's been fixed, but in order to empower people in that kind of a way. So that's like deep work on your whole community. Yeah. So if you can think of like the results magic, you know, I want a better job, that's one level of it, you know, and that's cool. Or the whole thing about like, I want to get like a deep process, which is going to help the community that I'm in, you know, that can be a part of that sort of procedure as well. And then there's all that stuff with like interacting with spirits, you know, interacting with those entities that one encounters in those states, you know, particularly the highly visionary, you know, NNDMT, ayahuasca, those kinds of materials, dialoguing with those entities, you know, asking questions, perhaps receiving challenges from those beings, and so there's a huge territory for people to work with. And of course, if you're working in a situation where you are doing some kind of let's call it shamanic practice because it's a good descriptor, and you're working with someone to do things like soul retrieval, extraction, to do things where you're helping someone find parts of themselves that are fractured in some way, that's a very, very powerful way of doing this kind of healing work. You know, people in many other settings than Northwest Europe have been doing this for a long time. We just have temporarily forgotten it, but luckily we're remembering it, you know, and not a moment too soon, as Terence McKenna might well say.
Oh, yeah. And I might add divination work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if psychedelics again give us an opportunity to be in the presence of wonder and mystery, then to be able to listen, which is what divination fundamentally is about. It's about that kind of listening to the universe. So you know, yes, there can be forms of divination that ultimately turn into like spell casting activity, but mostly what we're trying to do is we're trying to find out about things. So we're trying to listen rather than speak. And yeah, all kinds of divination of techniques are possible with that. I guess the thing about it for me is that if you're a magician and you're interested in deploying any of these techniques, then whilst you may not necessarily want to deploy them while you're on drugs or you've taken drugs, the use of substances can very much inform your practice for any of these things. And many of these processes, the magical processes, they blend perfectly with particularly psychedelic substances. You know, they are essentially designed to be used in that way. Divination, where you take a collection of perhaps tarot cards or other random things and you throw them down and you attempt to make novel meaning from them, and trying to from that meaning making process have insight into perhaps the past, the present, the future. That's exactly what a psychedelic brain wants to do. It wants to take the kind of the radical cross wiring of the neurons and make meaning from it, as well as engaging with this wonder. This is one of the other things that the psychedelic brain does, is it kind of it's like a gestalt kind of like consciousness. It kind of goes, oh, I see it. I see the whole of the thing, sometimes including the really difficult and the really bad stuff as well, you know, of course. So this ability for looking at divination, where what we're often trying to do, depending on the style that we're using, you know, natal astrology is very different from something like trying to read a divination in the movement of smoke from a candle, the flame of a candle. But nevertheless, for many of those systems that rely on a kind of holistic processing of data, a kind of this sort of way of thinking in a way that's very highly symbolic and associative, and also penetrates to levels of meaning that we didn't consciously previously understand. Psychedelic drugs, blend beautifully with that.
Mm-hmm. It's also because it's important what you said, especially from, let's say, an animistic point of view. It's every data counts. There is no data that you should ignore, so to say. So it's often a problem when you come from a materialistic worldview, that you try to find the one connection, and you try to shove everything else away and just find these two things, that the cause and effect relationship of the world. And then you go to Africa and look at the shaman, or whatever you want to call it. And he throws in like a bunch of bones, and suddenly a cat is hunted by a dog, and everything is disturbed. It has a meaning in a holistic divinatory system, that cat and the dog running and disturbing all the bones that are there in the field of divination. In an animistic worldview, or in a holistic worldview, you would include that to your divinatory process. That has a meaning. You cannot, I have to throw the bones again. You don't do that. And psychedelic states, or whatever you want to call them, they help to understand the interconnectedness of those things and the interiority of the meanings of that. And whatever that means, who knows? It's quite a challenge for you.
That I think what you just said there, I mean, this is to cut a long story short. What I often say to people is, I say, look, I'm an occultist, I'm a magician. I believe that everything in the universe is intimately interconnected, and sometimes I can notice those interconnections. And so what psychedelics do is they create a mind, create a brain, create a neurology where things that were previously discrete, so for example, the perceptual processes that deal with sight and the perceptual processes that deal with vision, they cross wire. Suddenly they are intimately interconnected. I can close my eyes and see all these astonishing fractal forms and faces and beings, all kinds of stuff's going on, you know. So psychedelics give a visceral, a physical, bodily experience of the reality of that interconnection. And I guess this is the other thing about when we think of, like, I don't know, the sacred mushrooms and the mycelium and the networks, and you know, Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus, you know, this idea of a very straightforward equal sign kind of causality. We know that this is, you know, it has some utility, it has some value, it has a degree of meaning, but it's clearly not the whole story. It's clearly not the whole story on so many different levels, that I think being able to, as, you know, Europeans, open ourselves to those ideas, which were either completely owned by, and even then, you know, not really very accessible to most people, or organized religion of various forms, and then radically excluded, arguably for some good reasons, within the scientific discourse and the emergence of that. We need to be able to say, this is also admissible evidence. This is also part of the true story. And that's actually how most people live their lives anyhow. It's just that it's about kind of sitting with that, and like my friend, me saying, well, clearly they met a spirit. You know, clearly it's a perfectly reasonable way of framing this to say, yeah, they met a spirit and they went into the MDMA experience, they met a spirit, the spirit told them some stuff, and then they were healed. There's no problem with that. That's not the, you know, the difficulty that you find is that still within our intellectual tradition, that's crazy talk. You know, when I did the psilocybin trial in 2019, one of the questions that the lovely doctor who was kind of checking out, was I a schizoid personality type, gave me this standard issue medical, you know, psychiatric evaluation questionnaire. One of the questions on it was, do you believe that you are ever in communication with beings that other people cannot see? And I said, look, Neil, because he was called Neil, I said, Neil, in the context of this interview, I see what you're driving at. The answer is no. And we laughed because and the question was like, there was a whole bunch of stuff like that. You know, do you believe that that you might have a special purpose in the world? Obviously, you're supposed to say, well, no, of course I don't believe that. That's craziness, isn't it? And that's nonsense. Actually, of course, many people do. In one way or another, they have a sense of their own, like, teleology or will or whatever it happens to be, project. But it's still, we still have this tradition it's attenuating now. It's kind of, I think it is on the wane, but that you couldn't say, oh yeah, I met a spirit and this thing happened and I went to see the shaman and they cast the bones and then these other spirits came running into the room and disrupted the whole reading. So we decided that that's what it meant, you know, brackets, the spirits were a cat and a dog or whatever. You know, you know, to own that language, I think, is really important, and it's really empowering and useful.
It's also, I mean, I think it might get better, but it's also when people lose someone and when someone dies and then they have a spirit contact with the recently deceased, and it helps elevate their grief. Like, who are you to tell them that that's not real? Like, fuck you. That's not your, like, you must not take that away from people just because of some belief system that makes that crazy talk. It helps those people. Who cares? That's their problem. And yeah, you're an asshole when you do that. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think obviously, you know, this is not a kind of purely romantic kind of anti-rationalist viewpoint, because it's actually just about allowing for the reality of the subjective experience. I can still then say, do you think the reason that you dreamt this or that because of these other factors, that's okay as well. Yeah, that's okay too. But it's also, I have to recognize that person is, if they're not lying, then they really had that experience. And also, if that's a true experience, then seeing it through the lens of an animist view may reveal things which are very helpful, in the same way that being able to view it through the lens of their pharmacology. Oh, I see, you know, your blood pressure is incredibly low. That's why you're having all these kind of dizzy moments where you're experiencing this stuff. That's a factor as well, you know?
Sure.
So it's about having that multiplicity. An example I often give is, like, you can have a painting, right? You can have a painting, and the painting, you can look at this in loads of different ways. If you're a conservator in a museum, you look at the painting and you're interested in the chemical composition and how it's going to degrade in the presence of ultraviolet light. That's what you're interested in. If you're a gallery visitor, you're interested as to whether or not you like this painting, whether or not you think it's beautiful, whether you'd like to take it home or not, whether you've got any, you know, engagement with it or whatever. If you're an art historian, you have another view. If you're an antique dealer and a valuer, you have another view. It's all the same painting. You know, it's all the same phenomena, but what we draw from it and what our languages and our discourses allow us to get. And that's where chaos magic really, I think, is incredibly important. In addition to the fact that historically, it's within the chaos magic tradition that the use of psychoactives has been most well conserved, let's say, yeah, well used. You know, I mean, the Golden Dawn used mescaline, they used a variety of kind of substances. The neo-pagan community little bit, that's a thing, but certainly within, broadly speaking, the kind of chaos magic envelope, I think that there is that ability to engage with these substances quite well, because it's about having multiple perspectives, and it's also about not creating absolutes, separations between, you know, this is a drug experience, or this is a magical experience, or this is a, you know, like an experience when you're sober, whatever that means. I mean, how's the biology in your gut, and what have you been eating recently? You know, what's going on there? So that postmodern relativist kind of fluidity which chaos magic kind of brings into the story, I think, is incredibly important in terms of understanding all this stuff.
Earlier on, you referenced Terence McKenna, and that it's high point on how psychedelics influence our society. So what can they bring to us as, you know, our Western culture, who has had a separation with them? I mean, we had the mysteries of Ulysses. We had many long years, and the witchcraft and so on. But nowadays, our society is separated from them. So what can be the possibilities, and what do we have to take care of?
I think allowing for doing it in a good way, and allowing for law in your local environment, I would broadly speaking say that more people need to take more psychedelic drugs. And what I mean by that is, you know, that's kind of like a headline statement, but I think what it means is more people actually need access to the psychedelic state. We know that in our communities we have an epidemic, certainly in Britain and North America and so on, of mental illness. We've managed to get to a situation where we are very well fed, we are very well looked after in many respects. You know, epidemic disease by and large isn't such a big factor in most people's lives and most of the time, and we are absolutely insane. We are insane. We're mad. We're very, very, very unwell. And that's an interesting thing. Meanwhile, the culture that we've created is also predated on the biosphere to the point where it's at the stage of destroying the very tiny little spacecraft that we all live on, like all of us, you know. And that's, so that disjuncture, I think, can perhaps be helped by more people having more access to the psychedelic state, whether that's arrived at through drugs, or whether that's arrived at through breath work or whatever. I think that the fact that we know that these substances can give people a radically new way of understanding their own circumstances, and that can lead to individual healing. Perhaps at a cultural level, the fact that we haven't had these experiences in our culture for an incredibly long time, since, you know, like you say, since Eleusis, you know, what's that 1,600 years ago, that place shut down. And it was a monopoly, pretty much, as far as we can tell, or a near monopoly. So although those experiences have been kind of sort of admitted within a religious context, but very, very highly controlled within those settings, I think we need to let that out. I think we need to have those experiences in culture, accessible to many people from many different backgrounds and in many different settings, and obviously in a good way, so that those people can benefit from those things. The example that I give in that sort of situation is always to look back, exactly like you said, to Eleusis. You know, there's the ancient mysteries where people go through some kind of experience, probably a psychedelic ritual, and they come out with a sense that there is, in a sense, no death. Yeah, they kind of managed to leave their own egoic identity behind, at least for a time, and they come out and they have this kind of, you know, this radical experience, which is so powerful that even though it goes on from the Bronze Age up until 400 AD, basically no one writes down what actually went down. Like, whatever it was a big deal. Now, all the people in that temple, as well as there being women and slaves and people from the countryside, you know, bakers and artisans and so on. Also, you have all the major philosophers, you have the military leaders, you have the medics and clinicians, you have the lawgivers, you have the emperor himself goes to that ceremony. and goes through that experience and comes away with this radical way of understanding the world. Now, let's imagine our current political leadership, and if we were to say to them, folks, we're going to take you on an ayahuasca pilgrimage. Yeah? We're all going to jet off to Peru or wherever, and we're all going to take this magical medicine that allows you to understand yourself and your relationship with the world in a radically new way. Can you imagine Donald Trump doing that? I mean, really? It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. And the very fact that that's hard, it's hard for us to imagine that the people who are in leadership positions within our culture could face their own ego annihilation in order to have a new relationship with the world and to go through that kind of transcendental moment, which it would seem on the basis of all the research is actively good for you. We can't imagine our leaders doing that. That's a really sad indictment of the culture we live in. So we've got this culture that's destroying the biosphere, run by people who we cannot imagine facing themselves, right? You know, incredibly well looked after, but also incredibly sad, to the point where, you know, in some places, you look at the figures for overdoses and youth suicide. Like, that's, yeah. So what we need is I agree with Terence. I fundamentally agree with not necessarily the whole of his analysis and not necessarily all of the stuff that he was into. You know, the guy's been dead a few years now. He would be saying other things now. He was still with us. But the basic idea of the archaic revival, the basic idea that dominator culture can be potentially transformed by these substances, I think is probably true. And I acknowledge the fact that, you know, you could have the Soma of Brave New World or the Moksha medicine of Ireland, and probably we'll get a mixture of the two. But if we actually genuinely believe that the psychedelic medicine is able to heal us, which is what it seems to do, then we should want to see it more broadly available in our culture in some way. You know, that's why I'm really pleased with people talk about the medicalization of psychedelics, like, you know, mostly because they're from America and they have a horrible, horrible, deeply inhuman system of so-called medical care. But the medicalization of psychedelics means that there will be people who would not normally encounter these substances that will be able to encounter them in a really good way. And I've been in that setting. I've seen how they hold the ritual, you know, and it's good. It's good. And many of the people who are holding that ritual are familiar with many rituals, in fact, unsurprisingly, you know. And if there would be people going to those rituals who would not go to Peru to an ayahuasca session, who would not go to, you know, wherever, who would not come and hang out with me and my friends while we do some sort of crazy, you know, chaos magic, whatever that means. But they're people who are nevertheless in pain and suffering. And they're also people who will be voting for whoever gets voted for next. Yeah. So bring it on.
Great.
Make this happen, huh?
It's worth a try. Like, you know, the thing is that people say when they're taking MDMA, they go, oh, wouldn't it be great if all the world leaders could get together and take MDMA? They'd sort the problems out. Well, maybe it'd be worth a go. Maybe it would genuinely be worth a go. Because, like, we've tried fucking loads of other stuff, you know, and like, it's worth a go, because the places have, you know, we have problems on spaceship Earth right now, you know. So let's at least try it.
No. But it's also important to say that just taking substances doesn't make you a better person. So if you're an asshole, you could still be an asshole afterwards. I just want to throw that in.
Oh man, totally. I mean, that's why, you know, all of this needs to be bracketed by the fact that, yeah, you can use LSD to absolutely terrorize and do horrible, horrible things. You know, embarrassingly, one of the first things that our culture did was to go, well, can we use this to kill other monkeys or at least drive them mad? Yeah. So like we have a history of not dealing with this stuff very well.
MK Ultra.
Yeah, absolutely has to be recognized. But what I guess when I am talking about this, I'm talking about it as like psychedelic in the sense of mind manifesting, this opportunity to get that wonder, to get that mystery, to experience that. And however we do that individually or as a community, is of less moment than getting that mind manifesting, that awareness of our own selves, and yet the kind of dissolving of ourselves in those moments, that kind of paradoxical, fabulous state that we can get. That doesn't come just by taking a big bucket load of drugs. It's a work, you know. You have to think about substance, but also setting and intention and all these things. You can't. That's the lovely thing about the psychedelic medical stuff, is that you can't be a doctor and just say, oh, I see you're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Here's your MDMA. I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Tell me if it helped. It's like, don't work like that. Totally different. Totally different. It's about relationship. It's about time. It's about awareness. It's about sensitivity. It's about connection. It's about all of those things. That's really where it comes down to. Yeah. It's not just about the molecule.
Yeah. It's this notion of interbeing, like the Buddhist term, it's not about the substance alone. It's not about the spirits alone. It's not about you or the. It's about all this connectedness and interwovenness of the world we live in.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I have maybe one of the last questions. What would you mean? You are in the you're quite involved with the breaking convention and stuff like that. Like, what would you say? And quite near the academic research and so on. What would you say would be the most important development or the most important discovery over the last few years in the sector? Is there something that you?
I think for me, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that firstly, I would take the question apart slightly and say that the nature of the psychedelic experience is that it's about multiplicity and rhizomatic change. So the fact that there are many things is part of the power of this, that there isn't actually necessarily one standout thing. But that aside, I would say that the MDMA research that MAPS have been doing primarily in the United States, because what you've got there is, I mean, the last time I looked at the figures, it was kind of, okay, here you are, you've got treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically, our culture has fucked you up as much as it possibly can by sending you into like really bad places, really bad war zones, or some other terrifying thing has happened to you. So you've got treatment-resistant PTSD. So not even just PTSD, but we've tried all kinds of stuff and we can't make it work. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration over in the US, in the process of licensing MDMA as a breakthrough treatment, because after longitudinal studies, we can see that the effects are like in the 70% kind of range for like long-term, not just remission from the PTSD, not just reduction of PTSD, but like people who no longer qualify as having post-traumatic stress disorder. So just the fact that, you know, there are many studies, and many of those studies are very small numbers of people over short periods of time, and they're valuable and they're interesting, and they pop up on social media and you go, oh, isn't that amazing? Or if you're more familiar with the territory, you say, yeah, well, I knew that all along. Fantastic. Obviously, N equals 20, whatever. But it's the long term, the big studies that we're starting to get now. You know, that I think is, for me, the real news. And it means that because of the effectiveness that's being demonstrated, that means that the medicalization, or the ability for our doctors, our actual healers and our nurses and our clinicians to use these medicines, because basically loads of other people can use them except those people, which is kind of interesting. The ability for those people to use these medicines and deploy them in their practice is going to come online very soon, is happening. Yeah. So that for me is like the big kind of territory. And whilst there are great, you know, there are things happening in the sort of medicine community, you know, like there's people kind of building all sorts of communities and awareness around kind of ayahuasca and being very kind of, there's a consciousness starting to develop about the politics of those things and the economics of those things. That stuff matters. But what matters mostly is not what the experience of a groovy trustafarian who's gone to Peru to take, whatever. That really doesn't matter. What matters, in my view, is getting the opportunity for that wonder and that mystery and that rediscovery of self by losing self to communities of people for whom that's totally out of the way. That's like members of my own family, my own community locally, for whom that's just totally, they've got no point of reference for that. So to be able to say to those people, look at this individual case study of this, I don't know, veteran, American service veteran or firefighter or whatever, look at this individual case study, see how the person who's being treated here looks more like you than I do with my weird hair and stuff. And also look at these numbers, look at this research, look at the fact that these legit organizations are doing this kind of work. That's, I think, the big thing, because it's, we can have fun in the psychedelic ghetto all we like, and we can paint the walls and have a brilliant time, and that's great. But we need to affect wider culture, if nothing else, because there's a whole bunch of people still in jail for all of these things, and people still going to jail for these substances, and we've got to address the bigger storyline, particularly at this time of ecological and social crisis.
Yeah, looks like the spirits found a way to wriggle their way into our society by means of our, slightly mechanistic worldview and statistics and everything, so that our senses can say, well, okay, let's give it a go.
That's a good way of describing it, actually. I often think, because the mythology around the discovery of LSD is like so archetypally powerful. That whole thing that as Europe is being ravaged by war within a mountain state, a Swiss chemist accidentally spills something. Like, who's more exact than a Swiss chemist? I can't imagine, whatever. So yeah, the spirits find their way. The spirits find their way. I looked at from a different perspective, looked at from the kind of perspective that, say, Dennis McKenna comes at this from, or like a magician would come at this from, or a shaman or whatever. You'd say these things have an agenda. Again, at this time of social and ecological crisis, these substances will use, they'll build their spirit body from the stuff you have in your head. So if the stuff you have in your head is called rational science, hey, no problem. I can do that. I can do graphs. I can do charts. Yeah, easy.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And well then said. We go on to your inner mythology and
yeah, well said. I don't have any more questions.
Julian, thank you so much for being here with us and for your insights and experiences. And I would love to talk to you again some point in the future.
Oh, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Yes, please, let's do that again sometime.
Yeah, I think there will be some very interesting developments down the road. So, we'll put your contact dates in the show notes and also your books, of course. And have a great evening so far. And thank you.
You guys, an absolute pleasure. Thank you both so much.
And all the books you wrote more than those two books. You wrote some books on Baphomet, obviously, some books on chaosmagic in general. We'll link them down in the video description, and yeah.
Brilliant. It all goes towards my children's education.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, and you also have your own YouTube channel where you occasionally post short clips and just general ideas and stuff. But highly recommended. I love those bits. Yeah.
I mean, most of the stuff you can find through the blog of Baphomet. That's kind of like, at least at the moment, where most of these kind of these things will be kind of linked to. So yeah, a pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe Baphomet could be another topic for another time.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that'd be great.
Great. Looking forward to it. Okay.
Okay.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Later.
The world is magical.
Yay.